thing. It's not always necessarily the case. And in fact, most of the research shows that what we actually need to be doing isn't trying to fix it in the way that we have been doing it, but we need to take a more targeted approach. We need to identify your serious chronic offenders, and that's the individuals where we need to focus most on, because they are not only are most likely to commit serious offenses, but they're most likely to be the offenders who are going to continue to do it over and over again. So they're accounting for a lot of crime, but they're a small group of people. In addition to the fact that we have some limitations when it comes to incapacitation and deterrence, I think it's always important for us to consider the cost associated with doing things. So yes, we have monetary costs, but the reality of the situation is that this cost has been extended to communities and it has not been equally distributed. The things that we have been doing to accomplish and do deterrence and incapacitation, we need to consider the cost of the current practice and how it has negatively and disproportionately impacted certain communities in Illinois, and in specifically minority communities. And as John mentioned, our focus and increased use of incarceration, as well as other types of supervision, reflected a real historical concern about violent crime, but it also represents a tangible way that the criminal justice system was trying to show communities that it was trying to address the crime problem. However, long-term over-reliance on formal controls, whether at the institution or in the community, to achieve a moderate amount of deterrence and incapacitation has significant consequences. And those consequences are more than just for the individual who you're incarcerating, but also for that they can create life-altering events that prevent those individuals once they return, but also affects both their families as well as their communities. So just as a summary, deterrence has some limitations, right? Many crimes go unreported, even fewer result in arrest and conviction. Case processing takes time. And although we've been able to increase the severity of punishment, and in some cases that approach may have been appropriate, we have also done a little bit of net widening and deepening involvement in the criminal justice system. So we now have more people involved for a longer period of time. And while incarceration has had a moderate impact on crime, right, through incapacitation, mass incarceration produces diminishing returns and is extremely costly. In deterrence and incapacitation, we can definitely conclude that it's complicated. It's not an easy zero-sum game. It varies by offender and offenses, and those things need to be considered as you're trying to apply on both deterrence and incapacitation. But what we need to understand, and as we try to figure out the best solution here, we need to understand and consider the costs associated with the benefits that we're actually gaining. And then finally, of course, increasing supervision and incarceration has consequences for many individuals, but most importantly, it also has consequences for the criminal justice system, and the ability to actually achieve the things that we do is contingent on the perception of legitimacy that exists. That's it.
Thank you, guys.
Still true. And when John reached out a couple of months ago and said, I'm from the authority and let's talk, I was really, really pleased that that happened, because my relationship with the Illinois Authority goes back to at least the early 1990s. And when we started our work on youth violence prevention in Boston, where a lot of this begins, when we figured out we were dealing with a gang problem and started taking that seriously, the software program that we used to map gangs and gang relationships out of our qualitative research in Boston was given to us by Rebecca Block, who was here then and who had developed that as, I think, maybe the first network analytics software developed for criminologists and then put out in the field anywhere in the country. And I've still got transparencies. Remember transparencies? That showed the gang relationships in Boston, and I will never forget the first time I showed this in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Boston. We put this thing up on the overhead projector, and all these gangs and gang beefs went up on the wall. And the gun and gang assistant U.S. attorney literally ran across the room and knelt down on the rug in front of the screen and started tracing these vectors, saying, "That's it. That's what's going on out there." And we knew we had it right. So it's really nice to be here. You, I suspect, just saw me nodding furiously in violent agreement with what Megan was telling you. So you're gonna hear a lot of overlap here. And let me start with something really simple on you, because deterrence is really simple on you. So Megan's right, it's really complicated. Partly because we've made it really complicated. And one of the things I'm going to try to do here is get it back to basics. Because at root, deterrence is really basic. It is the idea that people don't touch hot stoves. Right? If it's going to hurt, you're not going to do it. If it's going to extract a cost you don't want to pay, you're not going to do it. And there are lots and lots and lots of people in criminology and public policy and correction who don't believe that deterrence works. And none of them touch hot stoves, none of them play Russian roulette, and none of them cross the street with their eyes closed. Right? Sensible people don't do those things. And part of the power of deterrence as an idea and as a crime control approach comes from the fact that to any normal human being, when you say, we are going to make sure that the cost associated with this act is so high that no rational human being would want to pay it, we think it should work. And if it doesn't work, mostly we conclude that those people aren't rational. Right? They can't think straight, they have ungovernable impulses, they don't understand risk, they don't understand rewards, they don't care about themselves, and then we decide that they're sociopaths or psychopaths and all we can do is lock them up. So this is a really important turning point. If we get this right, we think it should make a big difference. If it's not working, it means that we have no rational alternatives at all. And we're dealing with aliens who are not like us. They are other, and they don't live in the same world that we do. Right? This is very, very important basic stuff. So here's the good news. Deterrence works. It is complicated. There's all sorts of research on this. Some of the best insight into this comes from absolute common sense. We also agree that one should focus on serious chronic offenders, and that's not life course criminology stuff. This isn't prediction. It's not profiling. It's who's doing this stuff out there, has been for 10 years, and won't stop, right? This is very basic stuff. And these guys will look you in the eye, and they will say, I don't care if I live or die. I don't care about going to jail. My friends are all there. I don't care about prison. I'll do my bid standing on my head. I'm going to be dead by the time I'm 25 anyway. And I spend a huge amount of my time explaining to cops especially, they don't mean it. That's what they say when you've caught them. It's too late to do anything about it. These guys, they stop selling drugs when there's a cop on the corner. When the guy gets out of his car, they run. While they're running, they throw the dope down the storm drain. When they get caught, they get defense lawyers and rat on their friends. And when they're shot, they cry for their mother. They don't want to go to jail. They don't want to get hurt. Nobody does. And you do find a few psychopaths out there. Not very many. Very, very few people willingly, knowledgeably want to have these bad things happen to them. You've heard this already. Deterrence, we think, is pretty simple. It is this certainty, swiftness, severity triad. These days, a lot we're adding something I think of as salience. What does this sanction matter to you? What is its meaning? How do you see it? But this, again, is very basic stuff. Jim Wilson, decades ago, said what any parent knows, and it's been said already, if you wait a year to punish your kid and maybe you don't do it, they don't learn anything. And the fact is, again, complicated, complicated, complicated. If we did dogs the way we do crime, you would bring the puppy home from the pound and put it in the living room, and 2 days later it would soil the living room rug, and you would wait 3 days and say to the dog, we don't do that here, don't do that again. And 3 days later it would do it again, and this time you wouldn't do anything. And 5 days later it would do it again, and you'd wait a week and you'd have another conversation with the dog. And the 15th time it soiled the living room rug, you would take it out, shoot it in the head, bury it in the backyard, go to your neighbor's fence and say, these dogs today, they have no respect for authority. I gave it so many chances. That's really how we do crime. And we know that doesn't work very well. But we really do understand the basics of what makes deterrence work. So we know that of all those things, it's severity that matters the least. And since when we talk about deterrence, we spend nearly all of our time talking about severity, in practice we completely forget about the swiftness and certainty stuff. We don't know where the tipping point is with swiftness. We know we're nowhere near it. And we know that when we're talking about crime, there's never any conversation about ramping up the number of ADAs and judges so you could bring these numbers down, right? That's not what we talk about. And we just know for a fact that that is a mistake. And this is worth dwelling on because it makes no sense to most of us that when we move a drug sentence from 5 years to 20 years, that it doesn't make any difference. So that's worth unpacking. So here are some things that are true about that problem. We can have enormous rates of enforcement and still not move the needle very much on swiftness and especially on certainty. So Chicago, where I spend a lot of time, is a city that still has a lot of street drug market problem. Peter Reuter and David Boyum, who are two of our best drug policy scholars, ran the math on the prison risk that is associated with selling cocaine in the United States. The number turns out to be 1 unit of prison risk per 15,000 drug sales. And again, you saw the funnel already. Not that many get reported. Drug dealing is a consensual crime. When they're reported, not that many actually get arrested. When they're arrested, not that many get charged. When they're charged, not that many get a stiff sanction. The number that get a stiff sanction is very small. And so the idea that in this era where we all recognize we're over-incarcerating already, that we could get the prison risk right by multiplying how many drug dealers are in prison by 15,000, not going to happen. Like, totally, totally not possible. When that guy goes out to the corner the day he's going to go to prison, or even more rarely, he's going to catch a federal sentence or something like that, there is no way that he can know that until he's in handcuffs and transported and charged and convicted. So we look at these guys and we say, they're irrational. Look at their records. They've got 30 priors. They get caught over and over and over again and they don't learn. For deterrence, the question is always, what does he think? And again, Megan touched on this. I want to emphasize it because it is so important. Deterrence is not about objective anything. It's not about what risk he actually faces. It's not about what's going to happen to him. It's what he thinks is going to happen to him. there is literally no way that when it's the 1 in 15,000 instead of the 1 in 14,999, that he can know that ahead of time. So that fact has no deterrent value. It will not, cannot change his behavior. And then in this country, we're in these stratospheric numbers. We're talking regularly about 10-year bids, 20-year bids. If you're in the federal system, people plead to 360 months because that's the best option they're going to get. And what we've forgotten is going to prison is terrible. Going to prison for a year is terrible. If you're doing it today because you think that's worth the risk, how much is that extra increment worth? You're already willing to do something that is associated with an awful, awful thing that, again, no human being would want to have happen to them. Making that almost indescribably awful thing 5 or 10 or 20 times worse doesn't mean that much. How big does the lottery have to be, right? So it's actually not that hard to understand why heavy sentences don't mean a lot. And it was, I think, the Class M bar graph that showed this doubling. Everything we know about deterrence, not incapacitation, that's a different conversation, but everything we know about deterrence says that that doubling probably brought the state of Illinois almost nothing in terms of deterrence. This gets easier to understand. Offenders mortgage things just like the rest of us do. And there's solid survey evidence that says when you're thinking about your future, that last 10 years of a 20-year sentence means less to you, just like the dollar you're paying on your 30-year mortgage in year 30 when you sign it today means less to you. Present value works here too. And again, remember, this is all about subjectivity. It's what this means to you when you're thinking about doing this thing. And the meaning of these long sentences are not 20 times worse. They're more like 2 times worse. Again, not that hard to understand once you start thinking about it this way. And we have a received ladder of what we think severity is. And it kind of goes probation, community corrections, jail, prison, long terms in prison. And we think that there's this correct and steady escalation from the low-level community stuff to the heavy-duty inside stuff. That's not right, as it turns out. That is not the way a lot of, again, these most serious guys behave. So, University of St. Louis folks do a huge amount of ethnography with street offenders. They get to know them really well. They learn how they think. This guy quoted is a serial strong-armed armed robber. He likes going to jail. He's one of the few of those people out there who likes going to jail. It's safer for him than being on the street. He can relax. Jail is not going to deter him. That doesn't mean that nothing will deter him. Right? This is where we need to be going with this. If what we're punishing with doesn't work, what would, right? And we'll get to that. But again, the survey work shows that the way we think about the escalation of severity is not the way the street thinks about it. And the overwhelming, interesting fact that comes out is that community supervision in various ways means more to them than we think, and it often is seen as more onerous than actually getting locked up. And anybody who's dealt with these guys on the street knows this. They don't like to be messed with, right? And when you're in the community and your boys are out having fun and your girl's out with them and you have to stay home on a bracelet and wonder what's going on, and your PO can come in at any moment and toss you around, you don't like that. You'd rather be in prison. And we see people who have the choice all over the country now, staying inside and serving out their sentences, rather than get out early and be on community supervision. They don't want to do it. We know that the moment you are arrested and convicted, and especially go to prison, much of what makes deterrence work goes away and can never be recovered. Because we think, again, the price of the conviction is the prison sentence. And that's right. But the price of conviction is also, and maybe even more, the fact that you will always be a felon. You'll never get a good job. Your lifetime earnings will go down forever. The likelihood that women are going to want you in their life goes way, way, way down. The likelihood that you're going to feel like you can hold your head up and be proud of yourself and that your mother is proud of you and all those things that mean so much to people go away. And when you're on the near side of that first act and the possibility of that first conviction, you stand there thinking, I've got all this to lose. And that goes into whatever your calculus is. Once we've taken it away, you never think that again. It's gone. And again, Megan said it, we now have lots of research on the damage to the individual, family, community that comes with having been locked up. But at the individual level where people make decisions, they've lost all that. Again, this is one of these what she said moments. The core of that hardcore population is operating in groups and networks and gangs and drug sets and all that sort of thing. They are not operating on their own. The concentration here is amazing. And this is a lot of where my work began. In every city where anybody has done the research, there are gangs and groups. Everybody in them adds up to under 0.5% of the jurisdiction, and they do 60 to 75% of all the homicides. You get the same concentration for frequent flyers across offense categories. The fact that these are groups doing these things fundamentally changes the way crime works and the way all of our crime interventions work, not just deterrence. But there are very clear implications when it comes to groups and violent crimes. It's a classic issue we've got. You've got two groups in the community. They're beefing. They've been beefing for years. They've been shooting each other back and forth. Two groups of 20. Law enforcement does a beautiful job, takes the last shooter from each side, puts him in prison for the rest of his life, and on the street you've got two groups of 19 guys with a beef, and nothing changes. Nothing changes. And they will be replaced. And in cities like Chicago, where you've still got some gang structure, if it's the guy at the top who's calling the green light and the guy at the bottom that's going to prison, you haven't deterred him at all. At all. Right? And because, I'll come back to this, the fundamental presentation of violent crime is groups and networks. And the fundamental presentation of criminal justice and the application of law and incarcerating people and supervising them is individual. There is the most fundamental, and as it turns out, significant mismatch here, which is a huge reason why not just deterrence, but other enforcement and prevention doesn't work. We're going after the groups by working on the individuals. And again, we can fix this, but this is a really big deal. Another, what she said, moment, lots of offenders we care about, they got locked up. They may be deterred. They are incapacitated while they're locked up. Doesn't matter, they get replaced. So the problem on the ground is not effective. the ladies in the room are going to love this one. We know for a fact that what scholarship calls informal social control matters more than formal social control. Healthy communities aren't healthy because Gary's got a cop on every corner and they're afraid of the U.S. attorney. They're healthy because the native norms and processes of the community support good and oppose bad, and they've got a good enough relationship with the police so that when that doesn't work, they call Gary and Gary can help. But raise your hand if when you grew up you were afraid of the police. That's your dad, Gary, I'm not talking about that.
One in the same.
Raise your hand if when you grew up you were afraid of your mother. That's the way the world works. It really does. And everything we know about the way people really behave says that their own ideas about right and wrong and the ideas of those close to them about right and wrong mean more than the law. And the reason I said the ladies will love this is because there is a true story about 10 years ago of the wives and girlfriends of the narcotraficante gangsters in Perea, Colombia, getting together and announcing what they called the crossed legs strike. And they said to their husbands and boyfriends, you turn your guns over or you're cut off. And it worked. I'm not really suggesting this as a policy option to the state of Illinois, something you should consider. But the fundamental about the power of the native capacity of communities is very real. And what we now know about a lot of the way we've been trying to do deterrence is that the way we have been doing enforcement undercuts those processes of informal social control. People need to think that the law is operating fairly. And we know that we've got a problem there, and we know now that we've got a crisis there. So we know for a fact that as these perceptions of legitimacy go down, especially in our most troubled communities, crime goes up. We know that as that becomes sufficiently prevalent and sufficiently severe, that the stigma of sanction, which we want it to carry, can become reversed, and going to prison becomes something a man does and that gives you status. We know that offenders and potential offenders can be angered enough by that perceived unfairness that they act out. It's what the literature calls backlash. People don't like being treated badly, right? And they take steps. In Rochester, New York, my colleague John Clopas interviewed gun offenders. Rochester had their version of the federal Project Exile program, which said, you get caught with a gun, we'll send you to prison for 5 years. There were radio spots and billboards all over Rochester. And what John's sources said was, we heard it, we know people to whom this has happened, it is not changing our behavior, and in fact, we're mad. And the story they told was, feds are all saying, you get caught with a gun, you get 5 years. We know lots of people who are getting caught with guns. They're not getting 5 years. And I know this guy who did get caught with a gun, and he did get 5 years, and he was black, and he was my friend, and he's in federal prison. And what this tells me is that the cops are racist, and this is personal, and I'm pissed off. Nobody had sat down with them and said, here are the federal rules about felons in possession, and you have to have the following priors, and we can only adopt some cases, and that's why some go and some don't. People have their own stories about what's happening, and their story was, these guys are doing to us what they've always done, and we've got our backs up. So I'm in New York City these days. This is Vera Institute of Justice research comes out of surveys of mostly black kids in high crime New York City neighborhoods. Their contact with the police is extreme. and they don't like it. So there's every reason to believe that a strategy designed to prevent gun crime and create deterrence has ended up with almost 90% of young people in those neighborhoods saying they don't trust the cops. Unintended, perfectly understandable. And the good news in this is that even though that's true, almost half would still ask the police for help, and a quarter will report crime. We're not in as bad shape on this as we think we are, right? But we've got a real problem. Again, deterrence is entirely subjective. You've got to know the stove is hot. People don't even understand the law. Very, very clearly documented. Any of you who have worked in practice with offenders know this. The research bears it out. Most people have no idea what the law really is. Often what they know, they think they know, is wrong. They don't even know what their own records are, right? We're doing what I'll talk about as custom notifications under Gary's guidance in Chicago. There's a famous story in Chicago now where the team went to a house of one of these chronic guys, said, everybody's watching you, here's your legal situation, we want to help you, you need to be careful. And he took violent exception to their description of his criminal record. And they had his criminal record, and they showed it to him. And the story everybody in Chicago is telling now, I'll use the olderized version. He said, oh, really? Gambling counts? Well, yes, it does, right? When it comes to those decisions and statutorialities for your next bid. Yes, it does. He remembered the big stuff. He'd forgotten all about the little stuff. This is a quote from a report by the California State Judiciary Committee, and it's just wonderful. And again, I hang out with prosecutors. 20 years ago, when I started hanging out with federal prosecutors, figuring out why they were going to adopt state gun cases, you know, there's felon in possession, there's armed career criminal. I couldn't get the AUSAs to explain to me why they took particular cases. They didn't know. You know, they'd look at the guy, they'd look at the law. I have a federal report in my file somewhere, 30 pages of guidance to line-serving prosecutors about what the felon in possession statute means. What cases count, what don't, under what circumstances, in what state. Nobody understands this stuff. And even when you do it for a living, it's a trial, as it were. The guys on the street don't understand any of it. And again, deterrence is about making good decisions about your risks. And if you don't understand this stuff, you cannot understand your risks. And because there's so much discretion in law enforcement, and there should be, right? We ought to be making decisions about where we're putting our attention. Even if you knew the law, even if you knew your own criminal record, if the DA or the police superintendent or the U.S. attorney has decided that you're a target, or now gang members are a target, or drug dealers are a target, or domestic violence offenders are a target, you can be walking around with a target on your back and have absolutely no idea. There is no way you can know this. And in Boston, our poster child for this was Freddie Cardozo. Freddie Cardozo got stopped by the gang unit in Roxbury and Blue Hill Avenue at 2 o'clock one morning, flipping a 9mm cartridge like a quarter, because Freddie knew his law. And he knew that in Massachusetts, he had just committed a non-arrestable misdemeanor offense, possessing ammunition without having a Massachusetts State's firearms ID card. And he went to court to get this slap on the wrist probation null pros, or whatever it was going to turn out to be. ATF met him, took him to the U.S. Attorney's Office. Don Stern adopted the case, and he went federal as an armed career criminal on the one bullet and got 15 years in Otisville, because they had his number already and they were looking for a chance to do this. When he got hit by that freight train, he never saw it coming. So deterrence says, again, know your risks and make good decisions. They don't know their risks, and sometimes they can't know their risks. Okay. Started with, this is simple, people don't play in traffic. This is simple, people don't play in traffic. We can get this right.
Yes.
And
Commissioner Sims.
the normal deterrence conversation is, can we fix the criminal justice system so we get deterrence? We know in that conversation that worrying about sanctions is what we should worry about the least. But it's also good reason to think now that we're asking the wrong question. The way to get deterrence, almost certainly, is not to try to fix the criminal justice system. Again, you heard a version of this already. It's to figure out how to solve important problems. And that we can do. So, here's what we've learned about getting this right. We need to focus on the small groups of really dangerous high flyers. And the nice thing about this is they're easy to identify. And just to say it again, this is not about looking at people when they're 7 and figuring out what they'll be like when they're 21. It's looking at people who are 21 and seeing what they're doing. And some of the most advanced work on this in the world is being done in Chicago through the partnership between CPD and Andy Papachristos at Yale. These exceptionally insightful applications of network analysis. Andy has found a network of about 1,500 people in West Garfield Park. And if you're in that network, your homicide risk every single year is 3,000 per 100,000. Nationally, it's 4 per 100,000 now. Andy's guys would be safer on the ground in Afghanistan than walking around in West Garfield Park. But if you're not in that network and you're in West Garfield Park, you're not at elevated risk. And those are the folks that we ought to be focusing on. When we're dealing with group dynamics, we've got to focus on the groups. Right? So this is now very common sense and very clear. And the good news on this is there are ways to focus on the groups using existing law. And you're going to hear about both of them from the Peoria team. One simply says, when you've got groups committing crimes and somebody's killed somebody, of course go after the shooter, but get the undercovers out there, buy drugs on the corner from every single one, get 3, get them videotaped, come back in 3 weeks, scoop everybody up, and make sure that everybody knows that the reason everybody's being held on solid drug charges is because of the homicide. All right? And the other is there's this very, very interesting new approach to doing both federal and state historical cases that makes those routinely applicable rather than the once in 10 years lightning strike that they normally are. But there are ways to focus on groups and to change the deterrence equation with respect to groups. We need to talk directly to these core guys. There isn't any more common phrase in criminal justice than sending signals. And sending signals is Don Stern sends Freddie Cardozo to jail for 15 years because he wants to make a statement about youth violence. The people standing next to Freddie Cardozo probably didn't understand that. So what we've learned is sit them down, look them in the eye, talk to them, explain what's going on. If they don't know what their risks are, tell them. If they don't know that the U.S. Attorney is making gun crime a priority, tell them. This is very simple, clear stuff. And there are all sorts of ways to do it. Chicago and Peoria and Rockford are doing custom notifications. They're doing these call-ins. Call-ins are you bring them to a room and talk to them. Custom notifications are you go to their house and talk to them. The version of this that relies on bringing these notifications into the routine business of releasing people from parole into the community was invented in Chicago between the U.S. Attorney's Office and CPD and IDOC. That's now being replicated all over the country. You can do the same thing with probation. We're discovering you can do it in prosecutorial offices. If you know that you've got one of these high flyers and he shows up in your system on an open container, pull him out, talk to him, let him know the way the world's working. Put him back in and let him deal with his beer case, right? So there are lots of ways to do this. But here's one of the most graphic, which is that Anthony Braga, who was part of the original Operation Ceasefire Boston 1 project research team in Boston, has continued his work there and has been able to look at the long-term violence preventive effect of going to a gang and saying to them, we are watching you because you are violent, and if you don't stop, we're coming in. And just the notification brings an almost 30% reduction in serious violent crime. And it's free, and nobody goes to prison, and you don't have all these other costs, and you can show the community that you want to keep their young men out of prison. You can ally social services and community contact. Talking to people really works. Doesn't always, but none of the stuff always, nothing we do always works. We know that we can deliberately organize the informal social control in communities. So we talk about collective efficacy and social capital and all of that as if it's just a fixed quantity. And that's wrong. If we know who the guy is who's driving the beef in the neighborhood, we can look at him, we can say, who does he respect in the neighborhood? He respects his coach from high school. He respects the OG that he looked up to when he was coming up. And that guy is now a gang violence worker. He respects his mother. He respects the mother on the next block whose son he knew, whose son is dead. The respect that they have for the surviving mothers is extraordinary. And we can create the contacts between the sources of informal social authority in which they say to the guys who need to hear it, we're not the cops, we're not social workers, we're from your community, this is wrong, we have to stop it, and we can't have this. And we know that this matters. Right? So that is configurable just like doing a drug raid or a jobs program is. We can create certainty where there is no certainty right now. So if we've got a city full of gangs shooting each other, we can sit down with one member from each one of those groups and say, in an hour you're going to be free to go, but the next one of your factions that shoots somebody, everybody in state, local, and federal law enforcement is going to make you a special project. And now that's true, and everybody knows it. We can say to them, we're going to be looking at every shooting, assault, rape, and home invasion that everybody in your group does. We're going to add it up, we're going to create a list, and whichever group is at the top of that list, we're going to make a special project. And we're going to make the list available so you know where you are. And if you're dumb enough to be at the top of it, it's on you. But if you like not to be on the top of it, you can race to the bottom. Right? For drug dealers, we figured out we could get a prosecutable case and not arrest them, which meant that when we called them in with their mothers and their grandmothers, we could say to them, you don't get to sell drugs anymore, because the next time you go to the corner, your chance is not 1 in 15,000. Your chance is 1 in 1. Here's the warrant. All we need to do is sign it. You're going to go to jail the next time you sell drugs where anybody can see you. Thank you for your time. This is what they did in Rockford. Works like a charm. And suddenly all these people who don't care about going to jail turn out to really care about going to jail. They don't want to do it. You can say there's a bell that's going to ring at the DA's office the next time you go in. All of your friends may be seeing the revolving door. You're not going to. And we're telling you ahead of time because we don't want you to do it. What has revolutionized probation is the Hawaii Hope Swiss Certain and Fair model that says to probationers when they get put on a caseload, every single time you violate, you're going to get a sanction. We're not going to send you back. We're not going to violate you. You're not going to go back for the rest of your sentence. But the day after you test purity, you're going to go to jail for a day. Every time, no discussion, no alternatives. Suddenly people who can't comply, comply. And the newest research on this says they haven't figured out how small that sanction needs to be. They started with a week, and then 2 weeks, and then 3 weeks. Doesn't matter. Then they went to a day, worked just as well. Now they're saying, you have to come in and sit in your PO's office for an hour. That's working just as well, right? We can ratchet down our punishments if we do this right. We need to tell people exactly what their risks are. If you are one of the several percent of people in the neighborhood who are serious chronic gun offenders, let's make sure you understand what the federal felon in possession laws are. And if you've gotten to the point where they're about to form up a task force to get you, let's see if telling you that will get you to stand down. Because if it does, that's fine. It turns out it usually does. If not, you go do it. It turns you into the poster child for the folks who we're going to talk to next. But direct communication about what people are actually up against means at least that they know, where right now, overwhelmingly, they don't. And then we've got to do what we say. We need to keep people updated. Again, this is very much parental stuff, and how many of you ever told your kids things once? All right? You tell them again, you tell them who didn't comply and what happened to them, you congratulate them because they did. Again, all this work we know about legitimacy, we're doing this to keep your neighborhood safe. It's not about you. We want you alive and out of prison. We hope we don't have to put hands on you. Here's the help. Here are the community folks who are on your side. This is objective, and it's in your community's best interest. And it's your best interest because you and your friends are the ones who are getting killed. And we're trying to keep you safe. And George Kelling, who taught me a lot of this, says, stop woofing. My cops love to woof. I know who you are. I know where you park your car. I know your mom. I know your girlfriend. I know every move you make. He said, I'm getting away with everything I do, and you know it all, so you're letting me? Right? Keep it simple. Keep it honest. And what we're seeing is we don't need the 20-year bids to make this work. It can be really small. In South Philly, they are stopping gang violence because they've discovered that gang members in South Philly are overwhelmingly stealing their electricity and their cable TV. And the word on the street in South Philly now, because they're being very deliberate about this, is if your crew shoots somebody today, tomorrow you're sitting in the dark reading comic books by candlelight and the food in your refrigerator is spoiling. Because we're going to bring the utility people in, we're going to cut off your illegal connections, and you can explain to your grandmother why that just happened. And we ride with these guys, and gang members in South Philly are coming up to the gang officers and saying, how do I get off this list? I don't want to be on this list. It doesn't have to be huge to be effective if we get it right. And for all kinds of reasons, from monetary cost to social cost to legitimacy to everything, keeping it low is what we want. And there's now a long list of effective applications of this. This is really, really concrete stuff. We know how to make it work with gangs. We know how to make it work with drug markets. Chicago figured out how to make it work with individual gun offenders. Others have done the same thing. The probation version of this is now called Swift, Certain, and Fair. It's growing like wildfire all over the country. We've got a version that appears to be working for domestic violence. They're using it to manage prisons in Washington State. Gary's old department is using it with robberies. High Point, North Carolina ran the numbers, identified their repeat offender larceny offenders, gave them custom notifications, and cut larceny citywide a third in the first 4 months. There's a version of Hawaii hopes with certain and fair that North Dakota is using on recidivist drunk drivers. You show up morning and night, you blow into a tube. If you've been drinking, you go to jail. That day, that's it. They're getting almost 98% compliance among the most incorrigible repeat drunk drivers. And the most interesting thing about this is 50% of the reduction persists after they're no longer being supervised. Somehow they're figuring out how to govern themselves or something, but there's long-time desistance. And here's my favorite at the moment. Our friend Susan Herman, who's the Deputy Commissioner for Collaborative Policing in New York City, is using this to manage the disorder that's been associated with the movement of these costume panhandlers from LA to Times Square. We've got Superman fighting with Gumby and fighting over Minnie Mouse in Times Square, and the tourists don't like it, and they're getting ripped off and robbed. So they're doing these focused interventions with the costume panhandlers, which of course we call costume notifications. These are big effects. So these are the studies that went into the recent International Campbell Collaboration, meta-analysis, systematic review, and these are big, big impacts. You get double-digit reductions in the most serious crimes. And this is just stuff that's been happening recently. These are mostly citywide homicide intervention versions of this stuff. But it's working all over the country. It's working in very serious environments. And despite the trouble and the heat that Chicago is getting, we know for a fact, because we've got the tracking and the research to establish it, that it is working on the ground in Chicago.